What's going on, everyone? It's the Fantasy Football Almanac, back at it with another fantasy football video. Today we are going to talk about lessons learned from Week 13 of the NFL season. Before we get into it, if you guys could, go down and give this video a like. I'm answering every single fantasy football related comment, so I'm sure you guys are all getting ready for playoffs. So if you guys have any questions related to playoff starts, it's anything, please ask me down below. I would love to help you all out. And subscribe to the channel, turn that notification bell on so you don't miss another video. With that, guys, let's hop right into it. In the first game of the week, I'm sure you guys all saw division rival Buffalo Bills versus the New England Patriots. This game was relatively uneventful. 17-10 at halftime, and then nothing really ended up happening at all in the second half. Josh Allen didn't really play all that well. Only 17 fantasy points. He looked good, but didn't really play all that well fantasy-wise. We see James Cook take more and more of the starting role as the season goes on, getting 14 carries and 6 targets, 6 receptions for another 41 yards. That's 20 total touches, and in the Bills' offense, that is really, really good. Well, he is a pretty risky start at the end of the season. I think this could show some progress to him being the starter next season. And that's really what you want to see from a guy who wasn't really getting utilized at all to begin the season. The only other player I want to talk about over on the Bills side is Gabe Davis. Gabe Davis has been one of the most disappointing fantasy players so far this year. Getting 7 targets, but only making 15 yards out of it. He does get a touchdown to salvage his day, but if you started him, you're going to be kicking yourself just a tiny bit. And Dawson Knox gets absolutely nothing done. One target, 0 receptions. Nothing really too good over on his side. Over on the Patriots side, no one was really all that productive. Mac Jones only getting 12 points. Rhamondre Stevenson was probably the only one who salvaged a day here, getting 8 total targets, but only really getting 10 points out of it. 10 carries for another 54 yards, does not get in the end zone. So he was not really able to have a great fantasy performance. But none of the New England wide receivers were able to have a good fantasy performance either. Their leading wide receiver was Tyquan Thornton with 4 fantasy points. Jacoby Myers limited to 3 fantasy points, 5 targets. That just shows, 1, how good the Bills' defense is, but 2, how scary this New England offense can be at times. The next game I want to talk about, a game I'm sure not a lot of you guys watched unless you are Pittsburgh Steelers fans or Atlanta Falcons fans. Who was really enjoying this game? I still didn't end up watching it. Kenny Pickett looked, again, decent. He hasn't looked bad like a Zach Wilson type when he started, but he hasn't really looked great either. He hasn't had a transcendent rookie year. He just looked okay. That's okay considering how bad this team is. We do see Najee play, which was a question mark the entire week, getting 17 carries for 86 yards, but only 9 fantasy points because, how often are the Steelers realistically going to get in the end zone? This led to Matthew Wright, their kicker, getting 16 fantasy points, which is a really good performance from a kicker, especially a kicker like Matthew Wright, a guy who rarely gets starts in the NFL. But other than that, really nobody was productive at all over on the Pittsburgh Steelers side. We had Deontay Johnson get 11 targets and not really doing anything with it. George Pickens only limited to 2 targets, 1 reception, and 2 yards, so you're really not happy if you started him. You're probably pretty pissed off, actually. And then over on the Falcons side, we have Mariota not doing much, Patterson not doing much, not even getting utilized at all in the receiving game, 0 targets. Algier not doing much, but getting 10 carries, which is notable. Drake London getting 12 fantasy points. Nobody else is really all that productive. For this game, I really don't think you could really realistically start anyone. Maybe you were starting Najee. You're probably starting Najee, but that's it. You really can't start anyone else from this. Moving on to our next game, we got another pretty painful game, a 10-9 showing. We got the Denver Broncos versus the Baltimore Ravens. Russell Wilson limited to 10 fantasy points. Latavius Murray getting a bulk of the carries, 17 carries for an inefficient 47 yards, but another 4 targets, finishing with 8 fantasy points, which is fine. He's the lead back. He'll get you decent production, but you're never going to be truly excited with what Latavius Murray is doing out there. Over on the wide receiver side, we got Jeudy leading it with 4 targets, 4 receptions, 65 yards. Nothing to write home about considering this offense never gets any touchdowns. Courtland Sutton is deemed day-to-day after getting an MRI on his hamstring, which is good news for Courtland Sutton owners. But honestly, is it though? Because I'm sure if you're a Courtland Sutton owner at this point, you probably just want him to be injured, be done, so you don't have to even consider starting him for the 1 week where he may boom. So, Courtland Sutton, not a guy I would really want to consider starting. So, Courtland Sutton, well, yes, he might play. If you have him, you might not even want to start him, realistically. Over on the Ravens side, we got Lamar Jackson out for, as John Harbaugh said, days to weeks. So, we probably have a week or 2 absence for Lamar Jackson. Now it has come out that he's week to week as of 3 hours ago. It is a knee problem. We should see Lamar come back for fantasy playoffs as long as your fantasy playoff starts in week 16, so he should be fine. You don't have to worry too much, but it is a little concerning, especially because Lamar probably is your quarterback 1, maybe is your quarterback 2 if you really went crazy this year, but you need Lamar back, I would assume. In the meantime, pick up Huntley. Huntley will be fine. He's a rushing quarterback as well, so his floor is higher than most other quarterbacks. But other than that, on the Ravens side, nobody really did anything. Same thing on the Broncos side. Kenyon Drake was the leading rusher with 7 carries, 29 yards. And then on the wide receiver side, it was another painful showing. Demarcus Robinson getting another 8 targets, which is somewhat promising, but doesn't really do much with it. Only 41 yards. And Mark Andrews not really all that successful either. So overall, a painful showing. None of these players were really all fantasy relevant, except for maybe Greg Dulcich. But anyways, let's move on to the next game. And that's the Green Bay Packers versus the Chicago Bears. Aaron Rodgers looked pretty much okay. How he's looked all season. A.J. Dillon is starting to take over this lead role because Aaron Jones potentially might be out for multiple weeks. The Green Bay Packers do have a bye week next week, which should give Aaron Jones some time to rest. But we'll get a clear diagnosis on the situation sometime before week 15, which will give us a lot more clarity on the situation. If Aaron Jones is to miss any time, obviously A.J. Dillon is the play. If not, then it's kind of hard to start either of them with a ton of confidence, as it's been all season. Christian Watson looking like the absolute stud he is. 1 carry for 46 yards and a touchdown, and then another 48 yards on 6 targets for another touchdown. He's been a touchdown machine, 8 touchdowns in 4 games. If you have him, you are very, very happy. I love this man, Christian Watson, with all my heart. I was drafting him so much in literally every single underdog fantasy draft. So, he's making my heart happy right now. He's doing me proud. I just hope he can continue on this pace. Alan Lazard looked okay. Randall Cobb, 4 targets, 0 receptions. Sounds like a classic Randall Cobb stat line at this point. Then we got Justin Fields. Justin Fields looking pretty good in his return, having 19 fantasy points. We see Montgomery, again, handling the bulk of the work, which is good now that Khalil Herbert is out, getting 14 fantasy points. None of these fantasy wide receivers are really even worth talking about. Claypool hasn't been good with the team since he started, and Darnell Mooney has missed time. Equipment of St. Brown has looked good, 85 yards and 4 targets, but I don't think he's a guy you're necessarily going to want to start here. Other than that, Cole Kmet was somewhat productive this week, getting 7 targets, 72 yards. But overall, again, not really a great game for fantasy unless you started Watson or Dillon. Now the next game I want to talk about is the Jaguars versus the Lions, the first real high-scoring game. And the only reason it was high-scoring was because the Lions made it high-scoring. I'll start with the Jaguars. Trevor Lawrence looked good, I will say, all things considered, but this game was filled with garbage time from the very start. Travis Etienne only able to get 6 points because they were down so early that they couldn't run the ball. Christian Kirk was the leading wide receiver, which is to be expected. There was a lot of Zay Jones hype coming into the week, which I wasn't really fully bought into. I think Zay Jones can have boom weeks, but I don't think it's going to be every single week. And then Christian Kirk has looked pretty good in my opinion this year. He's definitely passed the eye test, that's for sure. So I think Christian Kirk's good. Passing over 100 yards is exactly what you like to see, and getting another 8 targets is very good as well. Other than that, Evan Ingram getting 7 targets, a touchdown to salvage his fantasy performance. Moving on to the Lions, though, we see a ton of different players get involved. Jared Goff with 21 fantasy points looking great. DeAndre Swift getting 19 fantasy points. Some of his carries, though, came in garbage time. I think they were just trying to get him some more carries to see what he can do because they haven't really been giving him carries all year. But he does lead the Detroit Lions running back room. With Jamal Williams only getting 11 carries, 35 yards, and a touchdown. But he always does get that touchdown every single week. It's kind of crazy to watch. And then Amon St. Brown scoring 29 fantasy points, 12 targets, 114 yards, and 2 touchdowns. Looking like vintage Amon St. Brown. He's just so good out there. I'm excited to see how he looks with Jameson Williams, because now that he's going to have another threat on the outside, I think he's going to be absolutely unstoppable. TJ Chark also looking pretty good, 98 yards, 6 targets. Other than that, the only other player that produced in large quantities was field goal kicker Michael Bradley, who scored 19 fantasy points, which is really good for a fantasy kicker. Moving on to the next game, another stink fest. We got the Cleveland Browns versus the Houston Texans. I think the first person I have to talk about is Deshaun Watson. Deshaun Watson had a pretty bad game back. This is to be expected considering he was not allowed to practice with his teammates for the first 12 weeks of the season. Now, what he did was terrible, but now that he is back, I think we just got to talk about fantasy implications here. I mean, a little over 50% completion, 131 yards and interception. He really did not look good at all out there, and I mean, his fantasy performance reflected it too, with only 5 fantasy points. He'll get back into the swing of things, you would imagine. I mean, it's just rust from really not playing football in 2 years. Then we also have Nick Chubb and Kareem Hunt splitting carries. Kareem Hunt getting 9 carries for 56 yards, also getting involved a little bit in the receiving game with 3 targets. That's what we like to see now that Deshaun Watson is back, because Deshaun Watson does check it down a fair amount, despite what a lot of people think. Nick Chubb getting 17 carries for 80 yards, getting 8 fantasy points, but no touchdown, because the offense really didn't look all that good this week. We have Donovan Peoples-Jones getting 12 fantasy points, 44 yards, and Amari Cooper getting 9 targets, but not really doing all that much with it, only 40 yards. Again, I think this is going to be something that will be patched out over time because Deshaun Watson is just coming back. Over on the Texans side, overall, very, very painful. Kyle Allen doing absolutely nothing. Dameon Pierce getting 11 fantasy points through 73 yards, rushing another 22 yards. Receiving, no touchdown. But that's fine. I mean, you're not going to be mad at 11 fantasy points without a touchdown in a game as terrible as this one. None of the wide receivers really did all that much for the Texans. Nico Collins led the pack with 35 yards and a touchdown, but only had 3 receptions on 10 targets, which is not really all that great. And other than that, the only entity that really did all that well this game was the Cleveland Browns defense, dropping 31 points. What more can you ask for in a defense? If you started them, you probably won your week. You are probably a pretty happy man. So let's get what I want to talk about for this video, and if you do want to check it out, I will be posting a part 2 tomorrow, covering the rest of the games. The last game I'm talking about today is the Jets versus the Vikings. So from the Jets side, we see Mike White actually play better than I expected, getting 17 fantasy points. He did throw the game-losing interception, but on 57 pass attempts, how can you blame the guy for throwing 2 interceptions? They simply had to throw the ball a ton to make a comeback and try and get back into this game because they went down so early. Ben Wright actually looks really good in the wake of Michael Carter, 15 carries, 90 yards, and 5 receptions for another 28 yards, scoring 14 fantasy points despite not getting in the end zone. It's pretty good considering the game script he was in, for 1, and 2, the fact that he didn't score a touchdown, and 3, the fact that he was called up from practice squad a mere 2 weeks ago. James Robinson and Ty Johnson lacked involvement pretty much the entire game. James Robinson getting a mere 4 carries, and Ty Johnson getting 1 carry, but kind of stepping it up in the receiving game with 7 total targets. The wide receiver that everyone is talking about right now is Garrett Wilson, and Garrett Wilson looked absolutely phenomenal. 15 targets, yes, only 8 receptions, but 162 yards. That is incredible. He looks like everything you'd want out of a receiver and more coming out of college. I mean, especially with Mike White at the helm, still dominating. The only player he's looked bad with is Zach Wilson, and I think it's pretty obvious to see why. Zach Wilson has been terrible. Over on the Vikings side, we got Kirk Cousins looking pretty bad for fantasy, but I mean, you don't really need to do much. Dalvin Cook looks good. Madison even looks good, scoring a touchdown. Justin Jefferson doing his usual Justin Jefferson things, only has 45 yards, but still 15 fantasy points, which you're probably a little disappointed in because Justin Jefferson is that guy. But still, I mean, 15 fantasy points is fine, gets the touchdown. Other than that, nobody was really all that productive for the Minnesota Vikings. I mean, Rager, Thielen, Osborne all held under 6 fantasy points. Hawkinson even didn't really do much, but it's because they didn't have to. The team went up so early, they didn't even really need to score. But anyways, guys, that is going to be it for the video. I hope you guys did enjoy. If you did, go down and give this video a like. I'm answering every single fantasy football comment. So if you guys have any questions, please, please, please let me know. I want to help you all out so much. I want to see you guys win your fantasy championships, and subscribe to the channel. Turn that notification bell on. With that, guys, as always, have a good day, a good night, and a good life.